Mayoral Memo with Matthew Dickinson from Dubbo Regional Council.
Mayor of Dubbo Regional Council, Matthew Dickinson. Good morning.
Good morning. This is our last one for the year, Rod. It's actually been really good. I appreciate your time all throughout the year chatting to you and your listeners. So Merry Christmas to you and everyone that's listening, and I look forward to chatting to you again in a few weeks' time.
We certainly will, and I keep getting commented on that we speak with Dubbo. People really appreciate the fact that you're in the loop and they get to hear what's happening there, because most people get to Dubbo a few times a year.
I think it's one of the things that whenever I talk to government officials, trying to explain to them how important Dubbo is for the region and how important the region is for Dubbo, I actually see it as a very symbiotic relationship. We obviously need to make sure we've got the services here and the facilities that people around the region can use, and obviously those people around the region help our economy here, so it is very important. So I'm always happy to chat to people in the region, Rod, absolutely.
Yep, and a lot of people from Bourke live in Dubbo. They've gone there to retire. Most of us like to go to those big box places and buy the odd piece that we can't get in Bourke itself. Of course, you got all that fast food stuff there as well, and fancy restaurants.
And there's more than that. There are a few people that are still working that grew up in Bourke, and I know I've got an employee in one of my businesses that grew up in Bourke, and I know my Rotary Club's got a couple of members there that grew up in Bourke. So, yeah, there's certainly a Bourke flavour throughout Dubbo.
Good, and there should be more of it. And the old Dubbo jail, that's not where we want people of Bourke to be, in the new Dubbo jail. Is there such a thing?
Well, I don't know if it's called New Dubbo Jail, New Wellington Jail maybe, but certainly not a new Dubbo jail. But the old Dubbo jail is a fascinating place. One of the things I find fascinating about it is that Dubbo was gazetted a village on the 23rd of November 1849, but we had a lockup 2 years previous. So Dubbo didn't even exist as a village, and we had a lock-up. 1847, the jail opened up. 1905 was the last person hung there. 1877 was the first person hung there. So over those years, 8 people were hung during that time frame. It was still an operational jail in 1966. So there were many people who live in Dubbo now that remember that as an operational jail. And you look at the facilities there now and you think, gee, it's pretty primitive, but 1966 isn't that long ago. It was opened as a tourist attraction in 1974, so our 50th anniversary will be next year. But we've actually just upgraded some of the exhibits in there. And one of those exhibits is called the Life of Crime exhibit. And we've got one of our staff members, Chris Animat, who is very focused on the history in the jail and does a wonderful job there. 17 years he's been there. And he's done this process where he's looked for photos for people that have been in the old Dubbo jail at some stage during their life, and then tried to find photos throughout their time in different prison systems. So when people entered the system, the jail system, the first time they went to each jail, they'd have a photo taken. So he's got these series of photographs of people that have been repeat offenders as they went through the jail system in different jails, and the photos, and to see how much they've aged in a very short period of time, Rod, is quite fascinating. So it gives you a bit of a snapshot about how harsh the conditions were back when these people were going to jail. The exhibit is that successful that there's been a book created of it as well. So there's now a book called The Life of Crime. And so you can buy that book there at the Old Dubbo Jail as well. But even just looking at the exhibit there is all part of it. The other one I find absolutely fascinating is we've got the Gallows Gallery. Now, this has got all 32 people that were on death row in Old Dubbo Jail. As I mentioned, 8 of those were hung in the gallows there in Dubbo. 22 had their sentence commuted and 2 were acquitted of their crimes. But all 32 have got their stories there. Now, in the past, we've had a snapshot of their story, a bit of information about each of those people. But we've now added a touchscreen, and you can drill down and find all the information that's available about each of these people that are on death row. So you can look at prison records, you can look at court records, maybe newspaper clippings, any photos that were found. So each of those people there, you've got as much information as is possible out there on each of those. And so it's a fascinating background. And I actually find it fascinating, Rod, when you look through and see the various crimes that they committed and ending up on death row. Now, some of them were violent people. Some of them committed very violent crimes. We're talking about murders and rapes, and so being on death row would be the equivalent of being maybe in prison for life now. But there's also some ones there that you look at. For example, there's one person who was arrested on bestiality, And so, again, not the most pleasant thing to talk about on breakfast radio maybe, but with bestiality today, I'm not sure there'd be much more than embarrassment for you if you were caught with that. Whereas this person was on death row. There was another couple there. I'm assuming they were a couple. They were arrested and went to court on the same day in 1875, and they were charged with sodomy. Now, they were probably just boyfriends as far as I could work out from it. But again, they were on death row for sodomy. So again, attitudes to different things have changed pretty dramatically over the years. And it gives you an idea of just some of the background, if you like, of some things that happened not that long ago in our history.
Remarkable stories in the old Dubbo jail, worth checking out. And what's happening with the RFS in Dubbo?
Well, we've now got a new aviation centre of excellence. Now, the RFS, this is out of the airport. There's an emergency services precinct. So we've got RFS Dubbo headquarters, RFS training, now the RFS Aviation Centre of Excellence. You've got SES out there. You've got the VRA, New South Wales VRA out there as well. You've got a range of different emergency services. But this new RFS Aviation Centre of Excellence, the Minister, Jihad Dib, was in Dubbo last week to open this officially. And he talked about this as being a leading facility, a world-class facility, something that is available nowhere else in this nation. And he made the comment that in the past we might have looked overseas to see what people were doing and then copy them, but now he said people will be looking to us and copy what we're doing. Now, I actually had a bit of a look at the facilities and got to try some of the facilities. So, for example, they've got some helicopter shells, exactly the same as the real helicopters the RFS would use. You put the VR headset on, and then you've just been transported to a fire ground. You're flying above a fire ground. You've got the water bomber below. You've got the bird dog above you. You're actually interacting with these planes. You can have conversations with other pilots on these planes, all in a simulated environment. So when you're doing it for real, you might have done this simulated environment over and over and over, but you're doing it then for real. You're much more comfortable with it. The other one that I thought was very clever was one of the staff there told me about when he did his training initially, he was learning how to winch people up from a helicopter. And when they did the training, they would actually have a helicopter hovering above the ground, maybe spending $1,000 an hour just on the fuel to run that helicopter, for example. And then you're learning to winch people up and down. You're in training. You could make a mistake and you could actually have someone be injured or even potentially die in that training because it's a real life scenario. What they've now got is that simulated experience where you've got a gantry that sits above the ground and it's a couple of metres above the ground. So you can learn to hook people on, winch them up. And if something goes terribly wrong and you make a mistake, you might fall 1.5 metres. You might sprain your ankle at worst. So it's not going to be a dangerous situation. You do all the training there. And the same with the simulated helicopter training. You're doing that with a VR headset on. You're winching people up into the helicopter. You've got the rope there, but again, you're 0.5 metre off the ground. So it's not a dangerous environment. You do all that simulator training, then you go out and do your final compliance in a real helicopter. So that just sounds like a fantastic process. And the number of people that come through our facilities there, Rod, they've got 124 beds as part of this overall facility, and they're regularly booked out. They've got to actually send people into Dubbo to stay in the motel. So that is a great facility here in Dubbo.
Wonderful. The RFS Centre of Excellence. Is it open to the public or do they have open days or what's the go there, do you know?
It's not open to the public. They do training there. Obviously, it's a real live working training scenario there. I imagine they'll probably do some open days from time to time because I think people would be fascinated to look at that. And if you were, for example, a school group, I think if you contacted the RFS, I'm sure they'd be happy to take special groups like a school group through that particular centre there. So again, it's one of these things that it's fantastic for us to have in our environment. There's also the police training centre. That hasn't finished construction yet. That'll be open next year. That'll add to that whole precinct there.
And you mentioned the VRA rescue.
Yes, certainly there was actually another launch on Saturday, not quite as dramatic as the RFS Aviation Centre of Excellence, but VRA, Volunteer Rescue Association, they do an absolutely wonderful job in our area. If I was going to have an accident somewhere, Rod, I'd want to have it out in this area because we've got so many great emergency services out here and their facilities. So what they were launching on Saturday was some of their new facilities. And so you've got some of the vehicles that are there and all the facilities. They've got the Jaws of Life, as many people will be familiar with. And even just looking at how they've developed, talking to some of the volunteers there. So you've got the traditional hydraulic jaws of life, and you've got a range of ones there. You've got large cutters that'll cut through various parts of a car. If someone was stuck in a car, you've got the jaws of life to open up parts of a car. One of the ones there, one of the jaws of life, has got the equivalent pushing power to push apart things of 20 tonnes. So you've got a huge amount of power there. And with those hydraulic ones, you've got to hook the hydraulic hose on. You've got a small motor that's actually running the hydraulics of all that, which is what they've been using in the past. But they're progressing all the time, and they've got now new facilities that are battery operated. Again, similar amounts of power with the jaws of life and with some of these devices that can cut through some pretty heavy bits of metal. But because it's battery operated, the staff there or the volunteers there tell me that they're heavier to carry around, but you don't need to hook them up to something. So in some scenarios, they'll just grab one of these devices, put the battery on it, and off they go. It might be a car that might be a bit difficult to get to. It might be down an embankment, for example. So you've got all these different facilities. The other one they've got, which they launched, and I would have loved to have had a go of it, but I wasn't qualified to do that, but they've got a huge number of drones now. And these drones have got heat-seeking capability. So if there was, for example, an accident where you had a disaster and you might have had rubble over the top of someone, a building collapse, that type of thing, they can actually use heat-sensing capabilities as well as the cameras to actually try and find people in there. So these facilities, they're moving ahead with the times. Brenton Charlton is the commissioner, and I think he's very progressive in what he's trying to do with the VRA. But again, what gets me, Rod, is that first letter of VRA, volunteers. There are so many volunteers in our community that are doing things that, well, I don't want to do them. I don't want to be the first responder on a car crash trying to save people's lives there, but I'm glad that someone else does want to do it. And the expression that I hear often at these events is when people like myself are running away from these disasters, we've got some of these volunteers that are running towards these disasters to try and help people out. And I thank them from the bottom of my heart and from the bottom of this entire community that these people are there, and they'll be there all throughout Christmas, all throughout the holiday season, ready to respond if needed.
Yeah, remarkable that Dubbo has all these facilities, the VRA Rescue, the Rural Fire Service Centre of Excellence, the police training facility that will be open next year, and all of the people in those areas in Burke or Walgett or Coonamble, Wilkenia, Broken Hill will all be heading into Dubbo to get them further training.
Exactly right. And actually the police training is a really interesting one. Stan Single was the commander of police many years ago, and I remember speaking to Stan about this concept because he was responsible for police around the whole Arana area. And when they had to do their updates, for example, they had to do firearms updates so that you had to be able to make sure you could still be compliant to be able to use a firearm as a police officer. They would have to send those police down to Goulburn, for example, or I think sometimes they could go to Sydney as well, but take people from Burke to be able to keep their training up to date and to keep their compliance up to date. It was a long time that Stan was losing his staff for while they were going down to Goulburn or Sydney for that training. He had this dream of having a training facility in Dubbo, so all the people from the region could come to Dubbo, which was much easier to get to keep your training up to date. And that was where that little tiny seed of some sort of police training in Dubbo started. It's taken a fair few years to get there, but again, that'll open next year, and that will allow people from the region to keep all of their compliance training up to date by able to come to Dubbo and do that. So that's a pretty exciting facility, and it makes so much economic sense as well from the police force's perspective.
Oh, wonderful news. Now, tell me about the Wiradjuri Cultural Tourism Centre. How's that developing?
Well, it's developing slowly, much slower than I would like it to develop. This was a plan that started back in 2018 with some funding that came through for the government. There was some money that was around at the time from the state government for a few different facilities in Dubbo. One of them was a plaza out the front of the old Dubbo jail, which we're going through and constructing that. Another was a shared pathway behind Ollie Robbins Oval along the river, and that's under construction at the moment. But the third one was the Wiradjuri Cultural Tourism Centre. Now, I think this will be not just a great tourism facility for Dubbo, but I think from an Aboriginal perspective, it will be a wonderful Aboriginal tourism product for people across the nation and in fact even people internationally. Unfortunately, when Dubbo Regional Council was planning this back in 2018, they didn't quite get their budgets right for those three facilities, and we're a little bit short. We're short to the tune of around about $9 million, which I haven't got that in loose change in my back pocket, so I can't drop that into Dubbo Regional Council's fund. So we're looking for some other funding to complete these three. The first two, I'm pretty confident we've got those under control. The Wiradjuri Cultural Tourism Centre, we've gone to the federal government. There's a new fund they've got at the moment called Growing Regions Program, and they'll fund up to 50% of a project. This project at the moment as it sits, is about a $14.4 million project. Now, of that, we've got about $5 million from the New South Wales government with a Create New South Wales grant. We're asking the Growing Regions program for about $7.2 million. And then what we decided at our council meeting last week was that council, if we're successful with the Growing Regions money, would put the other $2.2 million in, and we do that as an internal loan. If we can get this facility up, and we've made it through the first part of the Growing Regions program, there's an EOI process. We've made it past that first part. We hopefully will get some news about that by maybe March. I'm estimating the grant application, the full grant, has to be in by the 15th of January, and then I think we'll have the result of that by about March. If we can then get that money from that, we'll have to have it built by the end of 2025. We've got the DA plans just about finalised, so I'm pretty confident that we would get it done. Well, we have to get it done by the end of 2025, but I'm feeling pretty confident that we'll actually get some of that money from the federal government, and I think that would be absolutely wonderful.
All the best with that. Would like to see that come to fruition. At that meeting last week of the Dubbo Regional Council, we're speaking with Mayor Matthew Dickinson. What else came up?
Well, certainly one of the other minor things that came up was that we have the ability to put an application in or a submission in to the Local Government Remuneration Tribunal. They ask for submissions from councils. Now, this is where they decide how much councillors and mayors across the state are paid. And so we didn't put a submission in to say, can you please pay us more money? Some people say councillors aren't paid enough, and I would agree with that it would be nice to see councillors paid more money. But what we did do is we said, please don't ask councillors to decide how much councillors are paid. The tribunal goes through and has a range of recommendations for different sized councils. And then they send that back out to the councils across the state and they say, you've now got to vote on how much you are paid within these guidelines. And if ever there's a conflict of interest, Rod, surely that's a clear conflict of interest. Asking councillors to vote on how much they're paid always is something that I think sits uncomfortably with most councillors. It looks bad from the community perspective as well. So we've actually put a submission in, or we've formally resolved to put a submission in to say, please just make a decision with all the information you've got available to you. You are the tribunal for a reason. Make a decision about how much councillors are paid, and then just tell councillors across the state, this is how much you're paid. And we have said that not just on behalf of Dubbo, but basically for all 128 councillors across the state. I don't know any councillors who love putting their hand up to vote to pay themselves more money. Surely you'd want to be paid more. Well, that's right. But again, because we're always trying to use the money to the best possible way, I don't think it's a good look in the community for councillors to put their hand up to say, yes, pay me more money. If you've made the decision, if you've got the guidelines in place from the tribunal, just make the decision and tell councils how much to pay us. It doesn't seem to sit comfortably with councillors to make that decision for basically telling them how much we're going to pay ourselves.
Speaking of sitting comfortably, how's the 3D printed toilet going?
There were some questions on notice that came through our council last week that had a few questions that I suppose people in the community were asking. There's this little debate going on at the moment about the style of toilets, and there are what's called the single cubicle style of toilets, where you've got one door that goes into one toilet, one basin, only one person can be there at the same time. And you've got the more efficient method of toilets, which basically you go into a toilet and there'll be multiple cubicles, a urinal, for example, and then a wash basin there for when you're finished in each of those cubicles. And Dubbo Regional Council has built some of the single cubicle style toilets in the past. And so, for example, in Wellington, they replaced some old toilets that were essentially multiple cubicle style toilets, and they replaced those with single cubicle. And the Wellington community has been up in arms since then, because that's in Cameron Park, and buses no longer stop at Cameron Park because they take too long for people to go to the toilet, because they replaced a number of cubicles with just 2 cubicles. And so, again, it takes a lot longer for people to go to the toilet. The new toilets that we built in Lions Park, the Macquarie Lions Park, West Dubbo, were printed with a 3D style printing methodology, the first in Australia where any government, any level of government has used 3D printing. And we chose to go with the much more efficient open style of toilet, where you've got multiple cubicles inside the toilet in a male and female environment, plus the disabled toilet as a separate toilet. And some people have said we should have built the single cubicle style, but that would have been much more expensive. So a question came from one of our councillors at the meeting, essentially, could we have used 3D printed toilets to print single cubicle style or the style that we've got? And of course, the answer from our staff was yes. 3D printing can print basically anything. That's the beauty of 3D printing. You can print any style you want. The other question that came was consideration given to the single cubicle style versus the open style? And of course, that was considered as part of the process, but it just would have been more expensive because building those single cubicle styles is more expensive to get a similar number of toilets. So in the end, the answers came through and they made sense to people. And to give you an idea, it was 2019 those toilets were built back in Cameron Park. They were built for just over $300,000 to give you 2 toilets. And the toilets that were built just recently in Macquarie Lions Park, West Dubbo, were built. Again, building prices have gone up quite dramatically over the last 4 years. So they were built for a similar figure, about $316,000, $322,000, around that sort of figure. So similar to the Cameron Park toilets. But for that price, we've got 5 female cubicles, 2 male cubicles, and a male urinal that could have 2 or 3 people standing there. So you could have a lot more people going at the same time with the same amount of money. So it really just came down to the most efficient use of funds.
Sounds to me like someone's got a bee in their bonnet and they just wanted to have control of the process. Now, closures. What's Dubbo Regional Council got happening with closures across the Christmas period?
Well, I'll run through a few different ones there. Our tourism facilities, for a start, if you look at things like Old Dubbo Jar, Wellington Caves, they're just closed on Christmas Day. The Wellington and Dubbo Visitor Information Centres are closed on Christmas Day and Boxing Day, but all that information is still available online. Western Plains Cultural Centre is closed on Christmas Day and on New Year's Day. And our Dubbo Regional Botanic Garden is the same, just on Christmas Day and on New Year's Day. They're the things I suppose most relevant to some of your listeners, but you've things got like the Garbos, the good old Garbos. They're working every day, no change in them. If you put your garbage out normally on Monday, on Christmas Day, put it out and our Garbos are out there doing that sort of work. Our waste disposal facilities in Dubbo and Wellington, Wallandra in Dubbo and then Wellington, that's closed just on Christmas Day. So again, most of those facilities are open as much as possible, excluding Christmas Day. And then if you wanted to actually go through and pay your rates, for example, our customer experience centres, they're closed from Friday through to Monday the 8th of January. So Friday the 22nd of December through to Monday the 8th of January. So if you have got an emergency, if you need to go and see someone, then you couldn't just walk into our front counter. But if you've got an emergency, still ring 6801 4000 and that goes through to our after hours call service over that time frame.
I thank you for your time today.
Always my pleasure, Rod. And again, look forward to talking to you again next year.
Thank you so much.
Mayoral Memo with Matthew Dickinson from Dubbo Regional Council.